The Last Week by Marcus Borg and John Crossan is a book that covers what the Gospels teach about Jesus' final days in Jerusalem. During Holy Week, we'll be sharing a summary of some of the events of each day. The day of Jesus' crucifixion is the most solemn day of the Christian year. Here is a summary of the last Friday from the book of Mark. As day breaks, the local collaborators, chief priests, elders, and scribes, hand over Jesus to Pilate, the local representative of the imperial authority. Pilate interrogates Jesus. Mark doesn't tell where this happened, but it is probably in the palace of the late King Herod the Great, which is where the Roman governors normally stayed while they were in Jerusalem. Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answers, "You say so," but makes no further reply. To refuse to respond to authority reflects both courage and contempt. Authorities do not like it, and Pilate is amazed. Indeed, Jesus does not speak again until his final cry from the cross later in the day. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Mark 15:34. Pilate then offers to release any prisoner, as was the custom, and he asks, "Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews?" That is, Jesus. But Mark says the temple authorities stirred up the crowd to have them release Barabbas, who had committed murder during an insurrection. He then asks the crowd, "What do you wish me to do with the man you call the King of the Jews?" They respond, "Crucify him." So Pilate releases Barabbas and hands Jesus over to his soldiers to be crucified. It is almost certain that this was not the same crowd that heard Jesus with delight during the week, as it is highly unlikely they would be allowed entry into Herod's palace, where this scene is set. This crowd was undoubtedly much smaller and led into the palace grounds by the authorities. Both Barabbas and Jesus are revolutionaries. Both defied imperial authority. But the first advocated violent revolution, and the second advocated nonviolence. Sadly for the Jerusalem crowd, by the year 66, most had chosen the way of Barabbas, not Jesus. Mark records this day in 3-hour increments. In these first 3 hours, Jesus, after being handed over to Pilate's soldiers, was tortured and humiliated. He was put through a mock coronation ceremony. They clothed him with a purple cloak, put a crown of thorns on his head, hailed him as King of the Jews, and struck and spit on him. He was then led out to be crucified. Prisoners condemned to death by crucifixion were normally required to carry the horizontal bar of the cross to the place of execution, but Mark records that the soldiers compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, to carry Jesus' cross. Presumably, this was not an act of kindness toward Jesus. He had simply become too weak to carry the wooden beam himself. At 9 a.m., at a place named Golgotha, Mark records simply, "And they crucified him." 15:24. His original audience would have understood this well, but we may need more explanation today. Crucifixion was a form of Roman imperial terrorism. It was reserved for very special victims, such as runaway slaves or rebel insurgents who subverted Roman law and thereby disturbed the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It was always public and intended to maximize the amount of suffering and humiliation. Once placed on the cross, Jesus is again mocked, presumably by the same people who had accused him before the high priest. On the cross was an inscription, "The King of the Jews." This was intended to be derisive and mocking, as if to say, "This person whom Rome has the power to execute is your king, some king." Jesus was crucified between two bandits. who are often thought to be thieves, but it is likely they were guerrilla fighters, because crucifixion was used specifically for people who refused to accept Roman imperial authority. From noon until 3 p.m., Mark says darkness came over the whole land. It is not certain if this was an actual physical phenomenon or a symbol of the grief and judgment associated with Christ's murder. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Shortly thereafter, Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. Two very significant events follow shortly. The first is the tearing of the temple curtain, torn completely in two from top to bottom. This curtain separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the sanctuary and has a twofold meaning. On the one hand, it is a judgment on the temple and the temple authorities who colluded with Imperial Rome to condemn Jesus to death. On the other hand, it is an affirmation. The execution of Jesus means that access to the presence of God is now open, no longer controlled by the temple officials and the domination system of Rome. Secondly, the imperial centurion in command of the soldiers who had crucified Jesus exclaims, "Truly, this man was God's Son." He is the first human in Mark's gospel to call Jesus God's Son. Not even Jesus' followers spoke of him this way at this point in Mark's account. That this explanation comes from a centurion is very significant. According to Roman imperial theology, the emperor was Son of God, the revelation of God's power and will for the earth. But now a representative of Rome affirms that this man Jesus, executed by the empire, is the Son of God. Thus, the emperor is not. There are more witnesses to Jesus' death, women looking on from a distance, including Mary Magdalene, Salome, and Mary, the mother of James, and Joseph. The presence of these women reminds us that Jesus' men are not present. Why would women of this time be attracted to Jesus? For the same reason as men. But in addition, it is clear that Jesus and earliest Christianity gave women an identity and status that they did not experience within the conventional wisdom of the time. Women in both Jewish and Gentile cultures were subordinated in many ways. When evening had come, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. He took down the body, wrapped it in a linen cloth, and laid it in a tomb that had been hewn out of the rock. He then rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. The authors of The Last Week raise the question, was the death of Jesus intended or inevitable? Did it have to happen? It might have turned out differently. Judas might not have betrayed Jesus. The authorities might have let Jesus go or decided on a course of action other than execution. It is never the will of God that a righteous man be crucified. But for another reason, the execution of Jesus was virtually inevitable. He stood against the Roman domination system, referring to them as tyrants and teaching, "It is not so among you. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom," a means of liberation for many. Mark saw Jesus' death as an execution by the authorities because of his challenge to the domination system. The decision to take action against Jesus was made after his disruptive act in the temple, and execution was what domination systems did to people who publicly and vigorously challenged them. But Jesus was not simply an unfortunate victim of a domination system's brutality. He was also a protagonist filled with passion. His message was about the kingdom of God. He was passionate about God and God's passion for justice. Jesus' passion for the kingdom of God led to what is often called his passion, namely his suffering and death. But to restrict Jesus' passion to his suffering and death is to ignore the passion that brought him to Jerusalem. To think of Jesus' passion as simply what happened on Good Friday is to separate his death from the passion that animated his life. Mark's story of Jesus' final week is a sequence of public demonstrations against and confrontations with the domination system. And as we all know, it led to his death.